We tend to think of spirituality as something otherworldly. That is to say, we have a tendency to draw distinctions between heaven and earth, the material and the spiritual, between this imperfect world of becoming and a higher, more perfect world of being. This dualistic view of the world, or some variation of it, is preached by many, if not most, of the world's religions and spiritual traditions. But Dogen, the 13th century Japanese Buddhist and founder of the Soto Zen school in Japan, challenges any such form of dualism which separates the sacred from the mundane. Our mistake is to set up a so-called higher world, heaven or nirvana, above and beyond the everyday world of the here and now. For, according to Dogen, if we truly understand this present moment, we will find we are lacking in nothing. Evidently, Dogen offers a unique and profound perspective on what spiritual enlightenment truly entails. As I intend to show, his thought is especially relevant to those who find themselves immersed in the world. This video will introduce you to the life and teachings of Dogen as presented in He Jin Kim's book Dogen, Mystical Realist, published in 2012. This is not a book for beginners. It is complex and at times dense, but I hope in this video to summarize some of the key themes. You will find a link to the book in the description. This video is in fact a follow-up to a previous presentation on my channel which looks at the Zen school of Buddhism more generally. If you are new to Zen, I'd encourage you to check that video out first. Don't forget to like and subscribe. Your support for this channel will enable it to grow. I hope you enjoy the video. It would be helpful to start by considering Dogen's social and historical context. The first half of the 13th century, the early Kamakura period in which Dogen lived and died, had many important features which influenced his life and thought. There were two opposing social forces in Japan at the time, the nobility, based in Kyoto, and the military, based in Kamakura. Dogen was born into the nobility. Now this class had been in decline for some time. Japanese aristocrats lived privileged and decadent lives, which left them increasingly indifferent to the masses. This period also saw the development of the samurai, a particular class of warriors who wrestled with the nobility for power and control. By this time, Buddhism was already established as a religion in Japan, but it was closely associated with the powers that be. Indeed, some saw the monastic profession as the surest way to wealth and power. Much Buddhist practice during this time revolved around the performance of rites and prayers, used to protect the nation and to bring about or secure the welfare of the nobility. Partly for these reasons, Buddhism was widely seen as a religion in crisis. The practice of Dharma and the attainment of enlightenment or awakening was seen as increasingly difficult, encouraging believers to turn towards ritual, faith, and devotion in the hope of some future salvation. For this reason, some scholars have compared 13th century Japanese Buddhism to Christianity, what with its emphasis or concern for faith and devotion. In summary, Dogen was born into a Japan beset by decadence, political infighting, and a general pessimism concerning the potential of human beings to achieve enlightenment in this life. Now, Dogen was born into a noble family in Kyoto in 1200 at the start of the century. Many of his family members occupied important positions in the imperial court, and it's likely that Dogen would have received a privileged education, granting him access to the classic works not only of Japan, his homeland, but also of China. Dogen's father died suddenly when he was but 2 years old. Then, aged 7, Dogen's mother died. Her dying wish was for Dogen to become a monastic in search of the truth of Buddhism and to relieve humanity of its tragic suffering. Evidently, from an early age, Dogen experienced the sheer impermanence and fragility of the world, and this would have had a profound impact on his young and sensitive mind. Later, Dogen would emphasize the relationship between the desire for enlightenment and the awareness of impermanence and death. To quote our author, to Dogen, the lucid understanding of life and the thorough penetration of death, that is, a total understanding of the meaning of impermanence and death, were the alpha and omega, the beginning and end of religion. Dogen's way of life was not a sentimental flight from, but a compassionate understanding of the intolerable reality of existence." End quote. Following his mother's death, Dogen was raised by one of his maternal uncles, who wanted Dogen to become his heir and initiate Dogen as a young man into the ranks of the Japanese aristocracy. But deeply moved by his mother's death, Dogen was instead determined to pursue the monastic path in search of answers to life's deepest questions. And so in 1213, aged just 13, Dogen was initiated into the Enryakuji temple in Japan. Here he engaged in a deep study of Buddhist texts. As our author writes, his earnest search for truth at that time and thereafter can be seen in the emphasis he placed on the need to live seriously. The impermanence of existence did not lead him to fatalism or to the pessimism that pervaded the age. On the contrary, it led him to heightened vitality in the search for the way." End quote. While studying Buddhism, the young Dogen was confronted with an apparently intractable question. If, as the various schools of Buddhism claim, human beings are by nature enlightened, why then did the Buddha find it necessary to seek enlightenment and engage in spiritual practice? No one at the temple could provide Dogen with a satisfactory answer. He remained restless with this question until he ultimately found an answer in 1225, which we will come to shortly. His question concerns the Mahayana doctrine of original enlightenment. Now we can think of Buddhism as being divided, as it were, into two quite broad camps, the Theravada on the one hand and the Mahayana on the other. I'm not going to go into detail now concerning the differences between these two schools. This could be the subject of a future video. Suffice it to say that Dogen's question concerned a doctrine, original enlightenment, which you found in the Mahayana school of Buddhism. The teaching of original enlightenment sanctifies mundane or everyday existence. Enlightenment, according to this teaching, is not some future experience, but a reality to be realized in the present. This is a profound doctrine, but it risks being misinterpreted as saying that no spiritual effort is needed whatsoever. After all, according to the Mahayana school, by our nature we are enlightened beings. Such misinterpretations were common during Dogen's day, especially among worldly-minded Buddhist monks. In raising his question, Dogen was not questioning the doctrine of original enlightenment, which he sincerely believed in, but he was effectively questioning the significance of human activity. Why exert oneself intellectually, morally, religiously, and so on, if one is already enlightened? Dogen passed his question to numerous teachers, none of whom were able to answer it to his satisfaction. But in 1225, Dogen experienced a breakthrough in his practice. And this was a breakthrough he experienced not in Japan, but in China, where he traveled in search of an answer to his pressing question. He met and spoke to a variety of monks in different temples, but wasn't really struck by any of them until, by word of mouth, he was referred to a certain monk a Zen master called Dogen, who apparently excelled in the practice of Zazen, sitting meditation, which we'll come to in a moment. His followers believed that he had reached or realized enlightenment in this life, and it was through learning from Dogen that Dogen ultimately found an answer to his question. Indeed, during a meditation session, a fellow monk had inadvertently fallen asleep. Upon seeing this, Dogen, Dogen's teacher, rebuked him. In Zazen meditation, it is imperative to cast off the body and mind. How could you indulge in sleeping? This remark shook Dogen's whole being. What Dogen's mind had been searching for was finally found in this moment. He had found an answer to his question. Enlightenment, Dogen realized, was something achieved in the here and now, in this very moment, through the practice of Zazen, sitting meditation. By casting off the body and mind, Dogen did not mean to reject ordinary human existence. Rather, human existence was seen as the means through which enlightenment is realized. This vision leads to an affirmation of our ordinary, relative, and temporal world, since it is through our action in this world, not in some hereafter, that we realize awakening. Dogen recognized the validity or authenticity of Dogen's experience and permitted him to return to Japan, his homeland, to share his realization. To quote our author, unlike other Buddhists who had previously studied in China, Dogen brought home with him no sutras, no images or documents. His sole souvenir presented to his countrymen was his body, mind, and total existence, now completely liberated and transformed. End quote. In returning to Japan to share his realization, Dogen transmitted the school of Soto Zen, which he had discovered in China, to his homeland. With the help of his followers, Dogen spread the teachings of Soto Zen through Japan, opening his monastery to everyone, regardless of social status, sex, or profession. During this time, Dogen also wrote his magnum opus, his main work, the Shobo Genzo. As part of this, he formulated a series of monastic rules to govern virtually every aspect of life. Seemingly mundane and ordinary activities, such as eating, were seen as spiritual exercises when performed mindfully. In 1228, Dogen wrote the text General Advice on the Principles of Zazen. At the beginning of the book, he stated, "If the way is originally perfect and ubiquitous, why do we distinguish between practice and enlightenment? The way is not separate from the here and now. When there is even the slightest gap between two opposites, they are poles asunder like heaven and earth. Although Buddha was endowed with natural knowledge, he sat in Zazen for 6 years. Therefore, desist from pursuing words and letters intellectually, and reflect upon yourself inwardly. Thus your body and mind shall be cast off naturally, and your original nature shall be realized. If you wish to attain it, be diligent in Zazen at once." End quote. For Dogen, Zazen was not one among many spiritual practices, but the very best of all practices. Other activities, for example, reciting sacred scriptures, burning incense, repeating mantras, became unnecessary. His emphasis on Zazen only meant that, for him, the most important matter in religion was not abstract doctrines and theories, but direct experience and activity. Dogen justified Zazen only, the practice of seated meditation, by referring to the historical fact that Siddhartha realized awakening through this method alone. Zazen should not be confused, however, with idle sitting. Instead, it entails a state of heightened awareness, of non-judgmental observation of the present moment. Dogen did not distinguish between enlightenment and practice. For him, they were one and the same, and this is one of the key features of the Soto school of Buddhism. To think that practice and enlightenment, writes Dogen, are not one is a non-Buddhist view. Therefore, in giving instruction for practice, a Zen teacher advises his or her disciples not to seek enlightenment apart from practice, for practice points directly to original enlightenment. End quote. In other words, Zazen is not used as a means, a method to attaining enlightenment. The practice of Zazen is enlightenment. Our practice is impure or inauthentic if and when we distinguish between it and enlightenment. Now, as I said before, Buddhism can be thought of as being divided into two big groups or categories, the Theravada and the Mahayana. Buddha nature is a Mahayana teaching, that all beings by nature possess the potential to become enlightened. Dogen interpreted this doctrine of Buddha nature in a unique way, leading to some profound implications concerning the nature of enlightenment or nirvana. Indeed, whereas other Buddhists interpreted Buddha nature to be an unchanging essence hidden within a person, such as a soul, Dogen understood it very differently. For him, Buddha nature is not a static potential awaiting realization at some future point, but is the dynamic and ever-present reality of all things. Buddha nature is not gained at some point in the future, but is to be realized in the unfolding of each moment. We see again and again the emphasis in Zen on the present moment. In other words, for Dogen, Buddha nature is not some hidden essence like a soul that's trapped within the body awaiting release. Buddha nature is the unfolding of the present moment, and nothing besides. This is a very radical understanding of Buddha nature and enlightenment, and it's helpful to explore it in a bit more detail with reference to what other religious traditions have said about enlightenment. Many spiritual and philosophical traditions are dualistic in that they distinguish between matter, the physical body, and spirit, the mind or soul. Whereas the former, matter, is impermanent and therefore seen to be ultimately illusory, the latter, spirit, is seen as permanent and therefore ultimately real. The goal of spiritual life is to deny the physical world, including the body and the five senses, and to turn inwards in search of the imperishable spiritual reality underlying the world. For example, influenced by the ideas of Greek thinkers such as Plato, Christianity came to distinguish between the physical body and the imperishable soul, and it's debatable whether this teaching is actually biblical or owes more to the ideas of Greek philosophy. Asceticism refers to the religious practice of denying the pleasures of the body, which are seen as inherently sinful, focusing instead on cultivating one's soul in hope of gaining salvation in the afterlife. In his search for enlightenment, Siddhartha, the historical Buddha, became an ascetic, but ultimately discovered that such a path led him nowhere. Similarly to this practice of asceticism and to the distinction between the physical and the spiritual, some schools of Buddhism believe, or have been interpreted as believing, that the goal of life is to escape, as it were, from samsara, the cycle of rebirth, by denying and turning away from the material world and all its temptations and imperfections. The 19th century German philosopher Friedrich Nietzsche, possibly the topic of a future video, rebuked all such thinking as nihilistic, by which he meant life-denying, since it devalues this world in favor of some higher spiritual reality. And for Nietzsche, this was ultimately an expression of weakness. Similarly, Dogen strongly argued against dualistic thinking, which distinguishes between spirit and matter, between this world and some future hereafter. What matters most in religion, as Dogen saw it, to quote our author, is not a deferred realization of immortality in an afterlife, nor an eternal recurrence of rebirths, but the realization of enlightenment here and now. End quote. This leads to a sacralization of this life. For Dogen, everyday actions, walking, eating, sleeping, are themselves expressions of Buddha nature. Realization for Dogen does not come from escaping the world, but from engaging fully and mindfully with the world as it is, recognizing that every aspect of life is an expression of Buddha nature. Evidently, what Dogen is pointing or gesturing to is the non-duality or non-difference of samsara, the cycle of rebirth, and nirvana, liberation. He argued that Buddha nature is not separate from the ordinary world of samsara. Rather, it is the true nature of samsara when perceived without delusion. This perspective contrasts with views that see samsara as something to be escaped in order to attain nirvana. From about 1250 onwards, Dogen suffered continuous ill health, reducing his monastic and literary activities. In 1253, aged 53, Dogen died in the posture of zazen, which speaks to the commitment of his practice. Following his death, his disciples preserved and spread his teachings, consolidating the influence of Soto Zen in Japan. Today, it is the largest school of Zen in Japan, and in the aftermath of World War II, Zen teachings also spread to the West, where they continue to attract interest and popularity. Thinkers and practitioners such as Alan Watts, for example, helped to share the teachings of Zen in a way that was understandable for a Western audience. With his emphasis on the unity of practice and enlightenment, his critiques of dualistic modes of thought, together with his affirmation of this world in spite of all its apparent imperfections, Dogen remains no doubt one of Japan's most innovative philosophers.